Welcome back to Recurrent Events, episode 3, and back with me is my recurring partner, my partner in crime here, Mr. Wes Schantz. Welcome back, Mr. Wes Schantz.
Hey, it's good to be back. This is, I think, the most frequently we've done this particular one since it was just last week that we put out the second episode, and here we are the following Friday.
Yeah, and I know we were thinking about doing either weekly or bi-weekly, I think it is, or bi-monthly, whatever it is, when it comes to 2 times a month or once every 2 weeks. But the main reason I think we wanted to talk today was because I had a chance to read one of your blog articles on sort of what it's like to be a substitute teacher and what you would like to do with substitute teaching and what it affords you the abilities to do and what you think could be different about being a substitute teacher. Because now you've been a classroom teacher and you've also been a long-term sub, and you've been a sub now up in Spokane for some time. So you've gotten to see a couple different ways of doing the teaching thing. And you've also taught online and are doing this with me. So you had written a little bit about the certification process, and I know even though we both share the same master's degree, I went to a state, California, that requires any public teacher to get a certification. So I immediately pursued that, though I was very much jealous of you and the fact that you didn't, because you went to Arizona, which didn't require that. And now you're sort of running into some of the problems of not having some sort of certification. And I was really interested to know sort of broadly your thoughts about the certification process of teachers, what you know from the Arizona and sort of Seattle and even Washington. You're in Spokane. Good job, Gonzaga, last night. And also Maryland, because you've taught there as well. And I could maybe fill in some details about the certification process and what it does here in California. We have the most rigorous in the country, and probably the most expensive as well. And I do believe it is the model for probably everywhere else. Though I suppose it's a federal system now. When it comes to no, it is state. But we're trying to make it, well, that's something I'd like to talk about too, to what extent education should be a local thing and to what extent it should have sort of a national sense to it. And maybe if we get philosophical, that's what we'll get to. And so, sorry, Wes, long question.
That's okay. No, I mean, there's a lot there, and I kind of sense that the state-federal question is a very important one, actually, that might sort of underlie, in some ways, a lot of the rest of that. At the time that I subbed in Maryland, they did not require subs to have any particular certification. And at the time that I taught in Arizona, they didn't require charter schools to have teachers certified as teachers, but to have instead specialty or expertise in some fashion in a field that they actually taught, at least for the high school, the secondary school level.
And how was that proved?
How was that proved? Oh, there was a few different ways you could show it, either a certain amount of coursework, a degree, or you had to, in some cases, take a equivalency test, like an exam. So there's a lot of legal sorts of, I guess you could call them loopholes, really, to allow someone like me to teach in those states. In Washington State, there's similarly a kind of exemption in subbing. So just to be a substitute teacher, they recently passed a provision that allows you to do that with only a bachelor's degree, and then meeting certain other requirements like a need for subs in your locality in the state. And then you can get certified to be just a substitute teacher in just that district. And I think that the term is like 3 years on that. And this is my 3rd year. And so I'm sort of at a point where I'm going to have to go through that process again. I'm not sure exactly what the process is to renew that, but I'm told it's not too bad. But, it's just like, it makes me wonder if maybe I should go ahead and try to get that full certification so I just don't have to do this again, and so I stop getting hassled by the man, but at the same time, it's a really sweet job being a sub. I really like it because it does allow me a lot of leisure time that I didn't have as a full-time teacher at the charter school where I was working. And I suppose that probably most teachers don't have unless they've really got their classes locked down or have really given up trying very hard. They probably bring home a lot of grading and do a lot of planning and all that good stuff that you do as a teacher. A sub gets away with not doing that. And I think that's awesome. And I think, there's lots of ways in which certification is probably useful for teachers, but I so far have found it to be onerous and undesirable.
Well, so to what extent do you think, and just to get a little speculative with this, and I can fill in some gaps from California's process, which I'm no major fan of, having had to go through it and pay quite a bit of money to do it. I'm effectively still in the red when it comes to netting money off being a teacher. So I've been a true federalist when it comes to all of this, moving to a different state in order to teach the children of another people's community, what I acquired through painstaking effort and sacrifice of great amounts of money, right? And now I teach effectively for free when it comes to the paying off of my student loans. And so that's sort of an interesting thing to add in there as well. So when you look at the legal profession, there's a high bar, and there's literally a test called the bar to get there, and you have to do a graduate program to get there. And then you make some amount of money. You make less if you go public. You make more if you go private. To be a doctor, there's also a certification process, which is fairly intense. You go to med school. It's very hard to get into med school. You have to have a certain sort of score on the MCAT to get into med school, which correlates very highly with G, which correlates highly with IQ, which means you have to be pretty smart, which is something that is at least highly correlated with genetic factors. Then again, you can make enough money to pay off your loans at some point, which will be considerable. But the thing about teaching is that teaching has a certification process, but I'm unclear that it has a direct correlation with one's ability to teach in the same way that going through medical school and then a residency program has an effect on somebody's ability to be a doctor, or going through law school and then sort of like a rigorous junior partner or associate program with a firm makes one into a lawyer. It seems like the process is costly, but short and ineffective, and does not build the skills necessary in order to produce an actual capable teacher, nor focus on the attributes of like classroom or personnel management that could be easily brought in for management science and developmental and social psychology, as well as teaching actual content knowledge, which is like intelligence, the most important thing a teacher can bring to the classroom.
Absolutely, man. And so you've actually taken some teacher training certification classes,
I am certified.
Right?
Yes.
So you can speak to this from within the system a bit better than I can. I've literally never taken a class towards certification. I did take one education class, but it was in the context of being a writing tutor at my undergrad institution back in Maryland. So that's as close as I've ever come to like the educational academy, so to speak. I avert my gaze from it as much as possible. I avoid it, and I feel like I could say, even stronger than that, it doesn't necessarily help you be a teacher. I think that it could well make you a worse teacher to go through a lot of that process and rigmarole. And many teachers don't stay in the profession more than a few years, whereas both of us have been in it for like a decade. And I think that speaks to our, foundational training, which is in liberal arts, which is what sustains us, I think.
Well, yeah, and you have to be tough and strong to be a teacher. I think that's a big weeding out factor. But that, well, it kind of sounds like part of what is making you buck against the man and the system that he imposes on us in our states with these certifications is that there's a drive towards professionalism with teachers and actually getting them certified, so that there is a difference between that person who is in the room with your children and anybody else. But also that there's sort of a sort of feel, and there are always progressive sort of trends in education too that focus on the artistic aspect of it, right? Like sort of Montessori methods or progressive school methods where like they go without curriculum or without classroom or without direction. I mean, those places I think tend to work because they have a high IQ population in general. And so it almost does not matter which direction you turn those kids in, and so long as you teach them some basics, because they're so quick, they can pick up what they need to. I don't know if that would work at every level. And I think that's a conversation I would like to have about problems with ideology affecting American education in ways that are not supported by science, that science could then help us to correct in a systemic way in order to produce better actual outcomes with our students.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interest in data and measurement of what seems to work and how to define that. And I think that there's a lot of, like, ironically, charter schools where teachers tend to be less traditionally certified, but are well trained and like very passionate. Like KIPP schools tend to do really, really well in lots of measurable ways. They're not, as you say, like progressive in that sort of anything goes kind of sense. Quite the contrary. They have kids wear uniforms and they have pretty strict curricula and this and that. And they take a lot of pains to like measure what they do and find what's effective and like work on those kind of best practices and things. I just think that for me, even that is not really, I think that is not really desirable writ large, probably. It's obviously very helpful for like changing long-standing problems in school districts that aren't doing well, and all that is very good. But as a teacher, I think that I would burn out of a place like that. I just don't know that I would be able to kind of maintain that level of intensity for a long period of time. And so I don't know that that's really the best model for building long-term solutions to these kind of vast educational morasses that we find ourselves in. But anyway, I don't know. Like, that's all very speculative. I feel that the idea that liberal arts and leisure can be included in a solution seems to me just as important as having like scientific backing and rigorous data and all that good stuff as well.
Yeah, no, you're making me think so many interesting thoughts right now, especially about how the KIPP academies have a sort of functional relevance in certain populations and certain, possibly certain socioeconomic strata too, and how one might approach educating within systems like that in a different way in order, if one sees society as sort of a stepping, a staircase that one can climb up, people at one level as opposed to people at another level would require different sort of, and this is something we run into in the education world, when we run into individualized education plans, like people at different developmental levels, and we know this from Piaget too, need to learn differing things at different times and possibly at different rates in order to get to the next level and continue to progress up. And so it makes perfect sense that, especially if we used IQ as a measure, that we would have specific schools that would focus on, grouping students in a relevant way together so that they could work in an optimal way to produce optimal results, optimally making them good citizens, but also highly skilled and capable of entering a profession at some point, which seems like it is part of the conversation when we talk about project-based learning and things like that in the industry, but it's also very much not a part of the conversation when we simply focus on, say, sending students to college, because it is by no means obvious that simply sending someone to college will prepare them for a profession in their life.
And as you say, I mean, the debt that you accrue is not necessarily serving you well in whatever profession you do end up finding yourself in after college. It's that higher education and the cost of it is, I think, a whole other discussion, but quite yeah, quite related, I suppose, to the sort of public education designs and goals as they sort of see them.
Well, and,
I
it's tied. Yeah, sorry, it's tied to our goals because we
yeah,
seen because of the cost of higher education. That's why we're offering this, and also as people who are civically minded and have a public spirit, we're trying to be the ultimate public teachers, right? We're teaching anybody who will listen and putting it out there for everybody. And so I do see that spirit running through you and through myself, and that can be also why you sort of buck at certification, because you sort of have the essence of a teacher. And so who's going to tell you you're a teacher better than you just doing what you do?
yeah. Well, I think it's always a good question to ask, like, teaching for what, or like, success. How are we defining that with respect to education? What that actually looks like, and I here's an interesting way I think about this sometimes is like I was in many like measurable respects a really good student in school, but looking back, I don't think that I really cared practically at all about my classes. Like I just wanted to kind of get through them and get to go home, and then I could like read books and play video games and
Yeah.
play soccer. Like I wanted to do all these things as a kid, and being at school was really not one of them. I never got into that until college, and then it was like a pretty much a 180. Like the
Right.
kind of learning community there was just so vibrant. And that's not something that kids are getting, even in these like quote unquote high performing schools. In most cases, like I really loved the school I taught at in Chandler, but there's many ways in which it was like much more high stress than is really conducive to like loving learning for its own sake, which I think is really the goal that I'm interested in. So
Well, so
I have
is
qualms
that
about that. Yeah.
in what ways can that be the goal of any education besides that of the university, which I consider sort of like the halo education, right? It used to be sort of super finishing school in the 19th century, the university, where a gentleman went who was going to be in a higher profession like preacher, or excuse me, priest, lawyer, or doctor, and went to indulge in the greatest thoughts that had ever existed, being in those libraries with, people like Plato, Aristotle, and such. To what extent can that actually helpfully be moved down to the secondary level, which I think is something we've both tried to do, when the secondary levels function might be, rather than edifying the student, to prepare them for a trade or to prepare them for the next step of life, and whatever that happens to be, the next step of life being autonomy in some way or another.
Well, yeah, I think that these are things that teach you how to learn is kind of what it comes down to. And in many ways, reading has been that sense about the scientific revolution and the Renaissance, and that has like gradually been sort of seeping down through the levels of society ever since. And I
Yes.
think that we're at the point now where it's widely enough available, and people are potentially given the kind of leisure time that's necessary because we have so much material well-being and such advanced technology. I don't see a reason why people shouldn't have the opportunity to study these kinds of great classical liberal arts and humanities types of things right alongside of all of their STEM and other sorts of training and technical stuff they might want to do. I think that there's room for both, and more than that, I think that the humanities are kind of closer to thinking about what it is that motivates you to learn anything, right? Whatever it might be, and to like cultivate that power and that desire for learning. That's always sort of the question that I come back to, and how best to do that, how to do that without maiming or distorting, right, the things that the person themselves might want to do, to sort of guide and shape a desire for learning without making it something kind of hackneyed and forced. That's a real sort of question that I struggle with, and right now I'm feeling like, play and games and things like that are a very interesting way to approach it, as well as language and reading, those that have been sort of the traditional approach, I think. But I feel like it's a very open and new territory, and that's why it's so exciting to kind of explore it along with you.
Right. And I mean, I think, I have multiple questions based on that. Like, how do you think best to develop a community of learning? And do you think developing a true community of the minds might be part of the answer to the increasing rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide in the young now, which are also quantifiable? And to what extent, this is a tangent, we now know through neuroscientific discoveries more about the nature of the brain and its relation to human behavioral adaptation and how humans develop throughout time that could then be used to model, fairly precise and strong behavioral, educational models, right? Like we can teach teachers the exact variable ratios necessary to optimize the reward they give to their students, and start to teach them the best ways to manage their students to get the best output. Again, this is what I was mentioning about like management science and neuroscience being useful for doing education better in quantifiable ways. But to what extent is sort of what we've learned and what we're learning right now also coming against a giant edifice and old institution of teaching where we still use bells that are vestiges of factories, and still have the same sort of like disciplines that are broken into, that were first split apart also for fairly artificial reasons. Well, though I don't necessarily want to go that route. I do feel like there may be actual differences, certainly between, like, say, English and science, which uses the scientific method. But to what extent are recent innovations blocked by old institutional structures, which might now be irrelevant and difficult to dismantle and to modify, at least on a wide scale range? I wonder to what extent this should be done locally.
Yeah, I think, if I'm correct, I might be getting this wrong, but I think that charter schools themselves grew out of ideas that kind of were hatched within public education as they were looking at some of this that you're describing and saying, like, how do we start to chip away at this, which is not really serving the students as well as we'd like. And so people within the teachers' unions actually advocated for having these sort of experimental schools, and charter schools have really exploded because people really like them. Like, generally people sign up to be on those waiting lists because they see that those schools are performing and offering things that the neighborhood schools are not. Now, I don't know that there's, as we said, there might be different needs in different places. And so I don't know that there's like a one answer to these kinds of questions, but as you're describing, the ways to approach them do seem to be along the lines of as we talk about in other places, a consilience, right? A coming together of scientific inquiry and humanistic ends, and having both of those sort of in mind. It seems like those are ways in which teachers of whatever subject can sort of feel that they are a part of something bigger. And I think that that's, for all that teachers are not as respected as other professions and aren't as paid as highly, that sense that they're involved in a great enterprise or endeavor, and that they are sort of like learning along with their students in various ways, that I think is kind of what still attracts people to the field, right? And there's now with with the technology that we have, like, there's no reason not to try all sorts of cool and experimental things, both within and outside of the traditional institutions. It's a really, really exciting time because all day long I can be subbing whatever class, doing whatever thing the teacher left me for us to do, which is generally like mind-numbingly little. But then, meanwhile, I can be reading and talking and learning from the students and like thinking about all the ways that we can change this system, and like actually be changing it when I get home and talking to you and reading and writing and doing all those things. It's like those things can happen hand in hand. The system is there, as I think of it, kind of like a chrysalis, from which all these new forms are emerging.
Yeah. And I mean, I think about that too, also being within the system and working in a charter school program, that basically what I get to do is active philosophy every day. A lot of what I do is share in contemplation with the students and engage in the process of thought in front of them, and then articulate those thoughts publicly for them in order to inform them. And so I'm actively involved in the shaping of their minds and the information which will be of relevance to them, as well as I build procedural knowledge into them too by, having them write and having them, and then criticizing their writing or editing it so that they then have to edit it as well. So, I'm actually helping to embody within them new capacities. So I am actually learning how to enhance to enact human potential, how to help a person embody their latent talent. And in so doing, I am also starting to embody my latent talent because I'm getting better at it. I'm getting better as a teacher every year. And so I get to observe not only the growth of my students, but also, since I teach the same classes most years in a row, which is not a privilege a lot of I think every teacher gets, I get to also have that fixed factor so that I can see that measuring stick, so that I can see myself improve as well. And that too is part of the rewarding aspect of being sort of a teacher. You are an artist with a canvas. That class is that canvas, that static structure, that factor, and your performance is the variable. And I think that's also an important thing about a charter school, where your performance is managed, and you never get tenure. So you always have to be getting better. You have to be like a professional athlete. You have to be like a professional. You never get that guaranteed check, which, Plato says that so long as you have an authority above you, you will act essentially appropriately in the laws. And I think that's correct, that when you are not given the leeway in order to become corrupt or poor at your job as a teacher, which is sort of the idea behind a charter teacher, just to mention another aspect of the profession, that it does keep you sharp. Like when you're an athlete and you have to every year perform in order to be picked up for the team. Not to the same degree, because in general, there are a lot more teachers than there are pro athletes, but the same idea, I think, lies behind it or underneath it.
I'm imagining now a thing like the Monty Python skit where it's like the philosophers playing soccer, like a bunch of people coming to watch great teachers. And maybe that's not so far away from what some of the major podcasts are basically like, right? You're describing them like professional athletes that, people go and watch that and root for their favorite team. Well, at least in Canada, they have like really, really famous debates between intellectuals every so often. So people go and watch those.
Well, as soon as we start getting invited to those, we'll go to those too, because I think you got to spend some time in the amateur leagues to show your stuff before you get picked up in the pros. And, often in baseball circles for pitchers, and that would be essentially what we would be the equivalent to, that it takes longer for them to come up because they have to develop their minds more than the fielders and the hitters. Because they have to be able to outthink professional hitters, which they can't do at first because they've always just been so talented that they didn't have to be as sharp and as judicious as they would have to become to be pros. And so I think, to some extent, we might And, the future will tell us what we're doing now better than I will tell us. So I hope I hear this at some point in the future and get to chuckle at this from a much better place. But, I think it just takes longer to develop, true mastery or the ability to wield the Masamune of Sephiroth, the great sword of the intellect. And, I think we're going along the right path. We're trying to innovate as teachers. We're offering our product publicly. We're offering a product. We're talking about what we think is important. It's like, what more can we be doing? I guess we could have some guests on this show. That should be the next step. Yeah.
All right. So we have a friend who recently passed the bar. He was one of our people we thought about bringing on. I did enjoy talking to Matt on the Consilience podcast the other day, as he was our guest in the side quests that we do. And I guess the question you brought up about mental health as it relates to public education, that's, I think, more along those lines, something that we could talk to him or somebody that he might know who works in that field in particular.
Yeah, and also just something about, he works at the charter schools in Nashville and Tennessee. Just some of the things that he's asked to do. He works with a very different population from me. I would say I'm in sort of a North County suburb of San Diego, middle class, mostly just middle, some lower middle, a few upper middle, but just a hardworking sort of group of individuals. He works with a far more diverse population than I do. And in some cases, and I'll let him say this when he gets on, he has several different languages represented in his room with very limited abilities to speak English among them. And so, I just want to have him lay that out a little, because that just sounds like a recipe for absolute chaos. That's the Tower of Babel embodied in your classroom.
It depends, I suppose, on the student, because on the other hand, like, I'm trying to imagine myself going to a new country, not knowing much of the language. I feel like I would be a really good student now. Sure. I don't know about if I was, still high school aged or whatever and had all those kinds of distractions going on. But
yeah, I'll be really interested to ask him how much success he's had and, what that can mean, because that's certainly true. Take the student's perspective too, that it's, they're in a new place where they're probably trying to learn as much as possible, as fast as possible. But yeah, it's just, he's had, I think, a very different experience, certainly from me, probably from us. And now he's a lawyer too. So it'll be interesting to have him on the, we'll have to let him know. And his name is David Oldham, now Esquire. We'll have to let him know that we want him and see if we can get him on here soon, next week or the week after.
All right. Sounds like a plan.
Okay. Well, great. And so I guess the world keeps turning and the events keep recurring until the next time the same thing happens again.
Yep. We didn't get to gene editing, but maybe that'll be another time.
Oh, yeah, we did want to bring that up. That is in the news. And so maybe next time, maybe we'll be on education for a little while. Maybe we can devote a little bit of time to it every day. Maybe we can get to the actual news. Yeah, that was a bit of news, not to just, to sort of take the scope out and demagnify or whatever, or demicrofy, go to the big picture. The big story has been gene editing and the sort of moral backlash against that, or the backlash of public opinion, and also some of the things they did wrong morally, supposedly, has come out, and that some of their standards were not up to ethical par. And that'll be, so I just don't know that much about this story yet, because I've only been skimming the headlines and the summaries, and I haven't even dug in. And maybe that's some comment on how the news is taken in these days too. But
all right, well, that can be for another time as well.
Yeah, right. So plenty more to come. So keep your pans. There's going to be some gold in the silt, as usual.
All right. Well, thanks again.
Thank you.